Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to get right to it. This week, we are going to look at time trouble, what causes time trouble, what we can do about it. We're going to talk about clock management, all that stuff, very important at the amateur level. And I'm going to be looking at this issue of time trouble from the point of view of an over-the-board chess player. So this is for your over-the-board chess tournaments, specifically with club level time controls, those quicker controls, such as the game 90s and the game 60s and the game 75s. I still consider those to be classical controls, but it's a faster classical control. It's a club level classical control. Although everything we're discussing this week certainly applies to quote unquote true classical time controls in major weekend open events, such as the 40 move in 2 hour type of tournaments. It's important up front. We need to acknowledge that the clock is as much a part of the game as the board and piece is, and there are psychological ramifications of that. Think of it this way. If I were to give you two puzzles of equal difficulty, and for the first puzzle, I said do it without a clock. Just take as much time as you need, just sit there and think, and come up with what you think is the best move. And then if I gave you another puzzle, or even the same puzzle, really doesn't matter. But if I said, do this next puzzle, but this time I'm going to put a chess clock on the table and I'm going to set it to 7 minutes because we're going to try to simulate tournament conditions. And if the 7 minutes runs out, then you run out of time. You have to come up with the solution within that time. Those two puzzles, those two situations, completely different experience, right? Solving the puzzle without the clock, completely different mindset, completely different psychological feel than completing the puzzle with the clock on. Because when you have the clock on, you are simulating tournament conditions, which creates a whole different sort of mental outlook, and it creates a certain amount of nervousness and pressure. It's a completely different experience. That's my point. Using a clock versus not using a clock, completely different. And we have to acknowledge that the clock is a major part of tournament play, and it can cause a lot of problems for many players who otherwise do very well without a clock. And I will say this, good clock control comes with experience, a lot of over-the-board play and building up your confidence as a player, and also making certain tweaks to your thought process, which I'm going to discuss throughout this episode. Now, one thing up front, longtime listeners of the podcast know that I'm a big fan of using the same opening repertoire. Stick with the same openings. And my main reason for that, which I've spoken about in past episodes, is that it cuts down on your study time. And instead of having to spend all your time memorizing openings and all these obscure lines, you can focus on calculation tactics, other things you need to work on. And if you play system openings especially, you'll understand the themes and ideas, and you won't have to rely so much on memorization. But one of the huge advantages of using the same opening repertoire is that it will help you avoid time trouble because you'll know what to do. Because again, you're using the same opening repertoire. So for example, if you have the white pieces, you need to know exactly how you're going to open and how you're going to respond. Are you going to open with D4, E4, and then whatever black responds with, you're going to know exactly what to play. If you have the black pieces, you need to know exactly how you're going to respond to E4, to D4, to knight F3, to C4, etc. But I'm amazed at how many amateur games I see where a player will have the black pieces, his opponent will open with, say, E4, and he's scratching his head for like 2-3 minutes wondering what to play. That's how you get into time trouble. You need to know exactly how you're going to respond to all the common opening moves. So if you have the black pieces, if your opponent plays E4, you have to know before the game even starts how you're going to respond. If he plays D4, you have to know before the game even starts how you're going to respond. I think you get the idea. And when you have that consistency in that same opening repertoire, you're going to understand the positions, and as such, you're not going to leak time on your clock in the opening because your repertoire is set. And the term I've used, you've heard it, is set it and forget it, right? I took that from an old infomercial. Develop your opening repertoire, and then you set it and forget it, play the same openings, and that's going to save you a ton of time in the opening phase of the game And that's an important point because I've advocated a consistent opening repertoire as far as cutting back on study time, but it'll also help you with time trouble in the game because you'll use less time on your clock. Now, the only exception would be if your opponent throws a novelty or some very unusual opening at you, then you are going to have to take your time and not just respond thoughtlessly and impulsively. That does happen. But in most of your games, you can expect your opponent to play, a fairly normal opening, not do anything crazy. And that's where having a set repertoire comes in because, again, you're going to save a ton of time on your clock. Now, the most important tip I can give you, and I think the most important point I'm going to make in this entire episode, is that to prevent time trouble, you need to avoid perfectionism. That's not a new term created by me. That is not new information. We're going to talk about perfectionism throughout this episode. And the thing is, where the idea of perfectionism comes from, let's just sort of get some definitions straight first. By perfectionism, we mean the idea of always striving for the perfect move, right? It has to be the best move. And we negate the idea of don't let perfect be the enemy of good, which is a philosophy you should adapt at the amateur level. So the traditional narrative, I'll put it this way. The traditional narrative is that we have to find the quote unquote best move or we've failed, right? It's either we find the best move or we're wrong, and we think in absolutes. Maurice Ashley has spoken about this. I've referred to him a number of times. And especially before the computer age, that was the whole narrative. That was the idea. It was always about finding the best move, and anything else was considered inadequate or not good. And at the amateur level, that is an awful approach to take, especially with some of those quicker club time controls that we spoke about. Adequate moves, playing moves that are good enough, are very, very powerful at the amateur level. Now, I'm not talking about playing in a mediocre way. I'm not saying you should embrace mediocrity. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to find the best move. Of course you should, but you have to be realistic with the time control and your ability. And if you find a move that's adequate, that doesn't worsen your position, that doesn't give your opponent an advantage, that's simply not a blunder, that is very, very effective. So if you find a move that's reasonable, like you might think, okay, something's telling me that there's a better move there. Like I can smell it, it's there's a better move. I just can't find it. If you find a move instead that's reasonable, play it. Play that move because that's one of the best ways to eat up time on your clock. Okay, one of the best ways, I should say, is you're trying to find this move that may or may not be there and you're eating up time on the clock when you already had a reasonable move. If you find that reasonable move, play it. Now, of course, you want to go for the best move, but if it's not happening, you need to move on. So adequate moves are very, very powerful at this level. In other words, simply don't blunder. Just don't blunder anything. Don't hang anything. Don't make a mistake. And if you're not seeing the quote unquote better move that you think is there, you need to move on. Because if you do that on every move, in something like a game 90 or a game 75, you're going to get into time trouble pretty quickly. So again, avoid perfectionism. If you play each move, if every time it's your turn to move, your attitude is, I have to find the best move, it has to be the perfect move every time, you're going to get into time trouble every game you play. You're going to have clock issues all the time, and you're never going to correct that mistake from your game. Embrace those more adequate moves when finding the quote unquote best move is just not happening for you, because we don't have that kind of talent at the amateur level. We're not going to be able to find the best move every time. It's just not going to happen. Now let's talk about some general clock wasters. These are things that can easily eat up time on your clock, and then all of a sudden you're in time pressure and you're not sure exactly what happened or how you got there. So let's discuss those. I'm basing this on my own play, my experience as a TD, and the thousands of games I've seen at the club, and in just talking to other amateur players. These things happen over and over again. I see them all the time. So let's talk about these. The first one is where you try to force a tactic or look for what they call a Zwischenschlag, like an in-between move on every move, right? So an opponent takes your piece, and rather than take the piece back, oh, there's got to be an in-between move. Let me look for a check because, I saw it in a book or I saw it in a puzzle. I mean, yes, of course, look for those winning moves. But a lot of players get into this thing where they do this on every single move. They think every move has an in-between move. I mean, yes, look to see if those moves exist, but most of the time, they won't be there. That's my point. And in the case of exchange sequences, as I was just alluding to, most of the time, the obvious recapture is usually going to be correct at the club level. So fine, look for the in-between moves, take a moment, but just know that most of the time they won't be there. And a lot of players look for these types of moves when they don't exist and they waste time on their clock. The next thing, which is similar to that, it goes along with that, is you spot a long, say, 5-move or more tactical sequence, or you think you spot it, right? It looks like a 5 or 6-move tactical sequence, and you spend a ton of time on the first few moves, but you give no thought to the follow-up. It's kind of like when people do a chess puzzle that, say, has 6 or 7 moves. You find the first move, you see that you got the first move right, but then you don't see the continuation and you read the answer in the back of the book, but you're like, oh, well, you know what? In a tournament, I'm sure I would have figured it out. No, that doesn't count. You haven't solved the puzzle just because you found the first move in the sequence. You need to see the whole thing through. And that's what happens in the actual game. People will find the first move of a long sequence, but they give no thought to the follow-up, and then they play the move, and then they don't have the chops or the talent to play the follow-up, and then they end up in a worse position or might even lose the game. And in that process, they ended up eating up a lot of time on their clock just to end up with a worse position. Because it's not enough to say, I think this is like a 5 to 7 move sequence. I can only spot the first 2 moves of that sequence, and I'm just going to play that. And meanwhile, you eat up so much time on your clock just looking for those first few moves, and then you end up lost because after that, you don't know the continuation and you wasted all this time on your clock. So that's something to be aware of. Very, very common. I see it all the time. The next thing that is a clock waster is obsessing between 2 relatively equal moves. Yes, check the tactics, make sure that one of them isn't flawed. You have to do that, but you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision and you have to make a move. That's a huge leak for many players. Now, the quote unquote, which rook do I put on the open file? They call that the which rook scenario. There's a book or somebody called it like the which rook scenario, which I like that term a lot. That's the classic example, right? Do I play rook FE1 or do I play rook AE1? And most of the time, unless there's an obvious tactical flaw with one of them, most of the time it doesn't matter. Okay, and the fact that the computer says that, well, if you had played rook FE1, it's 0.25 better than rook AE1, that's meaningless for 2 humans. That's basically equal. But people will waste, 6, 7, 8 minutes deciding which rook to put there. That's a very common example. Another example is when you can recapture with more than one piece. I mentioned exchange sequences and recapturing pieces. That's a major cause of time trouble. So he takes your bishop, right? Let's say he says knight takes bishop, and you can take back with either your knight or your pawn. Most of the time, or a lot of the time anyway, it's probably not going to matter. You can take back with your queen or you can take back with your rook, something like that. It may matter, and yes, you need to analyze it, but very often the way you recapture can be equal. So if you check the tactics and both recaptures are safe, if you can take back with either piece without a problem, just make a decision. Don't sit there and obsess and fall prey to the perfectionism we talked about earlier when you've analyzed that you can safely take back with either piece, and taking back with one over the other is not going to give you an advantage. All right, so those simple exchange sequences can be a major problem and a major cause of time trouble. And the next thing that eats up a lot of time on people's clocks is they don't know basic endgame themes. You need to know all of the basic endgame themes and patterns so that you can identify the winning plan or the correct defensive plan. and as such, save time on your clock. I'm referring to practical endgame themes, such as king and pawn versus king, the opposition, rook and pawn endings, counterplay versus material, things like that, passed pawn theory and tactics, because with passed pawns, in many cases, you can ignore material differences because the passed pawn is so powerful, or you can sack something because the passed pawn is going to queen, things like that. You need to be able to size that stuff up pretty quickly as far as the basic patterns. And if you haven't studied that, you're going to have to analyze that sort of organically on your own during the game when that's knowledge that you should have already. I'm not talking about these obscure, let's say, minor piece and pawn endgames. I'm talking about the real bread and butter endgame stuff. Like I said, king and pawn versus king in the opposition, the basics of rook and pawn endings, right? Like rooks belong behind passed pawns, and also counterplay versus material, all the things I mentioned. The basic building blocks of the endgame, you have to know that stuff, because not only does that knowledge allow you to understand the position generally, but it's going to help you sort of like smell when the position's a draw. Like you'll just sort of know. And yes, you still need to calculate in the end game, of course. That's often the place in the game where you need to calculate the most, right? Those end game calculation decisions like, do I trade down to a king and pawn ending? Is that going to be winning? Is that going to be losing? Is that going to be drawing? You often need a lot of time in the end game to calculate, which is a major reason why the clock is important, because when that intense end game calculation is required, many players find themselves low on time. And then that's where the blunders happen. So you want to leave yourself enough time for the end. So those are some general time wasters as far as your clock, things that can easily eat up clock time, sort of leaks in your game, if you will. Now let's talk about some ideas on how to get your opponent to eat up his or her clock time. As a general statement, any move that forces your opponent to think is good. Not only does he waste time on his clock, but it has the added benefit that he or she might blunder. And if you can make a move that causes your opponent to think and may induce a blunder, that's always a good thing. The second thing on how you can get your opponent to eat up clock time is if you can create a passed pawn. Passed pawns are very powerful, they're annoying, and if you create one so that your opponent has to defend it, he may need to use a lot of time to figure out the best way to handle it. Because what often happens is he may defend the passed pawn, but then you can create a threat somewhere else on the board, and he's not able to handle both threats. You have the passed pawn, and then you have an additional threat, and he can't protect both. So that passed pawn becomes insurance, so to speak. They're very powerful. Passed pawns are very annoying to deal with, especially once they get past the 5th rank and you're threatening to queen. So that can cause a lot of clock time to be used by your opponent. The next thing to get your opponent to eat up clock time is to stop counterplay. Make it difficult for him to find a plan. Those positions where a plan is not clear, that can eat up a lot of time for your opponent. So don't give him counterplay. Don't give him ideas. If you see an idea, try to stop it. Don't just think of your own ideas. Stopping counterplay and making it difficult for your opponent to find a plan is a great way to make him eat up clock time. And then the final thing to get your opponent to use clock time is to attack or play aggressive moves if warranted by the position. All right. Obviously, you can't just decide to attack. You have to go by the position and the pawn structure and all that stuff. But if the position allows you to do so, and you can attack or play aggressively in a sound way, definitely do it, for the simple reason that players hate defending. Players hate defending. I find that amateur chess players tend to be very offensive minded, but when it comes to defense and being prophylactic and preventing things, they really don't like it. And not only do they hate defending, most amateur players are not good at it. And they'll use up a lot of time to find the right move. It wears them down mentally, and then they could make a mistake later. So if you can put your opponent on the defensive and he really has to think, he can eat up a lot of clock time, giving you an advantage. The final segment of this episode is going to be a discussion of the book Chess for Tigers by Simon Webb. I've mentioned this book before. I did an entire episode reviewing this book. So if you want to check that out, it's episode 16 of this podcast, one of the earlier ones, where I did a review, again, of Chess for Tigers by Simon Webb. I consider that to be the most important book on chess psychology for amateur players. I'm always talking about The Amateur's Mind by Jeremy Silman and how important I think that book is. Chess for Tigers is probably the second most important book. Now, if you're a hobbyist or a recreational player, you may not need it. But if you plan on playing in tournaments or if you already play in tournaments, you definitely want that book, Chess for Tigers. It is absolutely essential. Now, the name is a little cheesy. It's a little corny. If I told you there was a book called Chess for Tigers, or if you saw it online, you would probably dismiss it. It should really be titled Chess Psychology for the Club Level Player or something like that, because that's what it's about. But he uses a lot of animal analogies in the book. That's where the title is. So, corny title, great book. And why am I mentioning it in this episode if I already did a review on it? Because chapter 10 of that book is called Clock Control, and the price of the book is worth it for that chapter alone. He speaks about time trouble and clock control in a dedicated chapter. It is the best literature on avoiding time trouble for club players that I have seen. Now, I'm not saying I've done an exhaustive review of all of the literature and videos out there on clock control, but to my knowledge, it's the best treatise out there on clock control. And I'm going to read some passages from that chapter because it applies directly to what we've been talking about. It's also the best book on chess psychology and practical matters for club players, as I alluded to earlier. Now, if you're a stronger player, or as you get stronger, you may want to check out The 7 Deadly Chess Sins by Jonathan Rowson. I did an episode on that book as well. That was number 29. I'll put a link for that. That is a more advanced book. I wouldn't take a look at that until you're about 1,400 or 1,500 or so. Once you're sort of an average or above average tournament player, that book's a little more advanced. But as far as Chess for Tigers, that's probably all you need for chess psychology for some time. So what I want to do now is read a few passages from chapter 10 of Chess for Tigers and then give my own little commentary and interpretation. That's coming up right after this short break. So here are the opening 2 paragraphs of chapter 10 in Chess for Tigers. The chapter again is called Clock Control. It's a dedicated chapter just on clock management and avoiding time pressure and everything we've spoken about. So this will help kind of tie everything together and sort of summarize everything we've talked about. So here we go. He says, control of the clock is one of the most important and most neglected aspects of practical play. Hundreds of volumes have been written on openings, and yet hardly anything on how to handle the clock correctly. So I will try to redress the balance to some small extent in this chapter. Ideally, you should apportion your time so that the length of time you think over each move is related to the difficulty of the move, and so that you use all the time available without having to rush at the end. This is easier said than done, and many experienced players, including some grandmasters, seem unable to avoid getting into time trouble game after game. As a result, they regularly throw away good positions and fail to achieve the results of which they are capable. If this sounds like you, then you have an easy way of improving your results. Stop getting into time trouble. Forget about openings, tactics, strategy, and all of the rest of the game. First, concentrate on this one aspect of chess, and when you have conquered it, your results will improve automatically. Only then should you return to improving the rest of your play. Then in the next section, he gives some tips on using your time effectively. Number 1 is go for a position you feel at home in. And he says this comes back to suiting your play to your natural style. As explained in chapter 3, if you can steer the game into a position which you feel you understand, not only will you play better, but you will also be able to play more quickly. Like a practical example of that is if someone opens with C4, let's say I have the black pieces and white opens with C4, the English opening. Now, that's notorious for transposing into standard queen pawn openings. So, what I'll try to do is steer that into a Nimzo or Queen's Indian defense, which I do know, which often isn't difficult because after C4, he's probably going to get in D4 and knight C3 anyway. So, that's just one example just from my own repertoire. So, go for a position that you feel comfortable in. If you can sort of steer the game into an opening you know, or transpose it into an opening you know, that's certainly going to help you. Number two, he says, have confidence in your own ability. I alluded to confidence earlier. I really think that comes from experience and just learning to trust yourself. But again, that comes from lots and lots of over the board play. But here's what he says about having confidence in your own ability. Don't be afraid to play good moves. The longer you think over a position, the less likely you are to change your mind about it. So if you see a good move, don't waste too much time wondering what's wrong with it. Play it and save your time in case things go wrong later. Don't be a nervous ninny and spend so long getting a one position that you don't have time to win it. Another very common thing at the amateur level. You have a better position, but you used so much time on your clock that you don't have enough time to win it because there is generally going to still be some calculation involved. Very, very common. I like what he says about not being a nervous ninny. I like the alliteration. You have to trust yourself. You have to trust your calculation and your intuition. If you see a good move and it's reasonable, you need to play it. So have confidence in your own ability. And the third thing he lists is don't be a perfectionist. Now, we spoke about perfectionism earlier. He talks about it in this book. There's a whole section on it in The 7 Deadly Chess Sins. That actually is one of the 7 chess sins, I should say. And here's what he says about perfectionism. Again, this is in Chess for Tigers, of course. He says, in the past, many leading grandmasters were so fascinated by chess that they couldn't resist the challenge of finding the very best move in a position, even if this meant spending up to an hour on a single move. Consequently, they often ended up having to make their last 10 or 15 moves in less than a minute. This perfectionism is all very well in analysis or in correspondence chess, but it's a handicap in over-the-board play. It seems to me that players such as Geller, Bronstein, Anderson, and Smejkal achieved good results in spite of being perfectionists, not because of it. Their love of the game explained why they were perfectionists as well as why they were good players, but maybe they would have been even better players if they had been content to play reasonable moves instead of always striving for the best move. Karpov and Larson, two of the most successful tournament players in the world, were known to be content with preserving their position by playing adequate moves in order to conserve their time and wait for their opponent to make a mistake. Nowadays, leading grandmasters get a lot of practice at quick play, and this has helped them to use their time effectively at normal time limits too. Anand is an example of a player who is known for making adequate moves at a steady speed rather than aiming for perfection. This is a more practical approach, for more games are lost through mistakes than are won by brilliancies, and if you want to get the best results you can, you would do well to follow his example. So that's a great line. Now, there's two things I want to repeat. I'm going to work backwards. He says more games are lost through mistakes than are won by brilliancies. Remember that. Put it on your fridge and embroider it on a pillow. More games are lost through mistakes than are won by brilliancies. It goes back to one of my favorite quotes by Grandmaster Larry Evans. I'm butchering the quote, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, it's far more important to not do anything stupid than to look for some brilliant tactic or something like that. That's the late, great Grandmaster Larry Evans. Great quote. And then that whole paragraph, what he says about being satisfied with adequate moves at a steady pace, that is incredibly true at the amateur level. I mean, as you can see with the Anand example, even at the GM level, this comes into play. But certainly at our level, playing adequate moves at a steady pace rather than looking for perfect moves and eating up a ton of clock time, the former is certainly the better option. And he has some other things in this section. I won't go on to read the entire chapter word for word, but you get the idea. So he gives some tips on using your time effectively, three of which I just mentioned. He then talks about how to get your opponent into time trouble. Now, I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I want you to hear what Simon Webb says in the book. And here we go. He says, you might think that the way to get people short of time is to make the position complicated, but my observations of addicts in action lead me to disagree with this approach. The positions where they seem to take the most time are those where there is no clear line of play and where they have to choose between several plans. Often these are quite simple-looking positions. For example, a perfectionist may spend half an hour wondering which file to put a rook on, particularly if he is unable to predict his opponent's reply. So that goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about the which rook move. He even mentions that in this book. And this reminds me also of my whole thing with like waiting moves and making nothing moves, which doesn't really change the nature of the position. And your opponent may get frustrated and then either use a lot of time on his clock or blunder. And then he goes on to say it's the non-forcing sort of positions which they tend to go to sleep over. And then he gives a little bit of a technique you can use to get your opponent to use more time on his clock. And this is what he says. As well as trying to stay in non-forcing positions, a useful ploy against many an addict is to walk away from the board and stay away so as not to wake him up. I know this conflicts with my advice to use your opponent's time for thinking, but it all depends on the particular situation, who you're playing, how difficult the position is, and so on. When he looks as if he is about to move, you can usually tell by the shifting of position and flexing of muscles in his arm. Return to the board and pretend to start concentrating hard. It's surprising how often this provokes or frightens him into going into another long trance. I'm not quite sure why this works, or indeed whether it is entirely my imagination, but it has worked for me over and over again, and the only way to test it is to try it yourself. Now, I will tell you, I do this all the time. I've used it many times, and it's very effective. Let me just kind of explain that in my own words. So the idea is your opponent is thinking, and what you do is while he's thinking, while his clock is running, you get up from the board. And right there, there's something unsettling about looking at the position, especially if he's a little insecure about what move to make. There's something very unsettling when you're not there and he's just staring at the board. And then what you do is when he looks like he's about to make a move, you then go back to the board, sit down, start concentrating hard, or look like you're concentrating hard. And that's going to kind of mess with his head a little bit. And it might make him think even longer and use even more time, right? Because it's almost like you're coming back and saying, what do you got now? And he might be a little hesitant to make the move now that you're sitting there. And it's kind of a cool way to get your opponent to use more clock time, or at least make him second guess the move he came up with and kind of mess with his confidence. It's not going to work all the time. It's not going to work on every opponent. And as with a lot of other things I speak about on this podcast, you need to pick your spots. But when used in the right moment against the right opponent, it can be a very, very effective trick getting him or her to use more clock time and maybe even blunder, right? They might have chosen a move that was indeed the best move, and then you come back and sit down and look like you're focusing, and they're about to make the move while you're there. They might change their mind. So that's a nice little trick that you can use. And now the last thing I'll say about this chapter in Chess for Tigers, he talks about what to do if you're in time trouble and what to do if your opponent's in time trouble. So if you are in time trouble, he says that you should look at the clock while it's your opponent's turn to move, not on your own time, and that while your opponent is thinking, you should work out a provisional reply to each likely move. If the position is very complicated, don't spend all of your remaining time trying to analyze it. Play the move which looks right, quote unquote, and hope for the best. That way you will conserve those valuable seconds for later. And then he says, don't write down your opponent's move when he makes it, but do write down your own move after playing it and pressing the clock, or at least make a mark on your score sheet because losing count of the moves can be disastrous. So those are some things he lists if you are in time trouble. Now, what if your opponent is in time trouble? He has a couple of pages on this, but the most important point is this. He says if you are winning, ignore it. Too many one games have been thrown away through trying to rush an opponent in time trouble. If you have a one position, just concentrate on winning it and don't worry about your opponent's antics with the clock. So in other words, if your opponent is in time trouble and you are winning, don't try to clock him. Just play like you normally would, and eventually he'll bust. He also describes an advanced technique you can use if your opponent is in time trouble but your position is worse, equal, or only slightly better. So this is a lot to think about, and I'm not going to review every point that I made now, but I think the most important takeaways are that, number one, if you don't conquer your time trouble issues, nothing else really matters. You could spend all the money you want on courses and books, and you could study for hours a week, but if time pressure is a consistent problem, none of that's really going to matter. So you really need to focus on that. And again, that's going to come through playing experience. The second major takeaway is to avoid perfectionism and to embrace those adequate moves. If you find a move that gets the job done, it's reasonable, it looks good, don't start questioning yourself that there might be a better move. That's going to be a major leak in your game, especially for these quicker club level time controls. The other takeaway is by using the same opening repertoire, you're going to save yourself a ton of time in the opening, because the opening phase of the game is where a lot of players waste time unnecessarily. In addition, you need to know all those basic endgame patterns, because that's going to help you size up the position quicker, and you won't have to waste time thinking about something that you'll know either theoretically or intuitively. For example, you'll learn to size up quickly whether or not trading down into a king and pawn endgame is going to be winning, losing, or drawing. Yes, you're going to have to do some calculation, but this will help reduce the amount of calculation you have to do if you understand all the basic building blocks of those endings. And lastly, this sort of goes with perfectionism. I probably should have included it with that. But again, just get it out of your head that it's always about finding the best move, and that if you don't find the quote unquote best move, that you've failed. We need to forget that narrative. And it's more about playing an acceptable move and not blundering than playing the perfect move every time. Because as I said in the opening of this episode, if you're going to look for the perfect move every single time it's your turn to move, you're always going to be in time pressure. So a lot to think about. Hope this helps. I'll put a link for Chess for Tigers and the previous podcast episodes that I mentioned in the show notes. It'll all be there for you to check out. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day, and I hope you win your next game.